we're here as the National Social Science Honor Society, and each year we bring a distinguished lecturer to the university, and usually in a different field of the social sciences. However, we constantly look for a person who bridges the sciences, the social sciences, and covers more than one. And we're very fortunate to be able to give such a person to you this year.
Hello, I'm Mujan, and this is Sail on a Beach podcast. This episode about that man. This episode's going to be all about Herbert Simon, his life and his work. But I don't want it to become another biography of him or a review of his work. I want to give Simon a taste of his own medicine. I want to show you how your take on creativity and creative thinking impacts the way you engage with history of ideas. Herbert Simon and the works he did with Alan Newman is a very interesting case. What they worked on wasn't just a particular question in a specific field. It was so fundamental and so complex that many fields found their work interesting. Some of them even owed their existence to the works Herbert Simon and Alan Newell did. Different fields are not only interested in different aspects of their work, but also different stages of their idea development. Urban planners are obsessed with Simon's early work on bounded rationality. Designers keep talking about their later work on heuristic problem solving. And psychologists and those involved in artificial intelligence are interested in their work on simulating human cognition. They're one of those prime examples of scholars who came up with such an influential idea that they're almost defined by it. Yet there's so many different interpretations of their work and so many different versions of their history that no matter how well you know them in your field, there's always an account of their work or their character that would surprise you. In the last episode, I told you about just one of the reports that he wrote on creativity and problem solving. But during his life, he authored 27 books and almost 1,000 papers. Since 2017, he's been one of the most cited persons in artificial intelligence and cognitive psychology. But his background was in political science. If I tell you that Simon was a great debater even when he was really young, that he wrote a letter to editor of a journal defending the civil liberties of atheists when he was in middle school, or that he was an active member of the debate team in his high school, you would find that impressive. How about knowing that he got his undergraduate degree from University of Chicago in political science when he was only 20 years old? Or that he got his PhD on the same subject from the same university when he was just 27? What if I tell you that it was his PhD project on organizational decision-making that landed him a job in Rand Corporation, made him a pioneer in artificial intelligence, and led him to win his Nobel Prize when he was 62? Just a quick look at his work and the awards he got would make you go, wow, he was a genius. For someone to go from a political science background to become a pioneer and innovator in so many different fields, including psychology, computer science, decision science, and mathematics, with today's standards, is impressive. But if I give you a bit more context about the institutions he worked in, the institutions he studied in, the lecturers he had, friends he had, his family, his childhood, and the context in which he did all these works, then you might arrive at a conclusion not unlike what Herbert Simon, Alan Newman, and Cliff Shaw argued in their creativity report. You would say, well, it's obvious. If I was him and had all those opportunities and had all those ideas around me, I would have achieved as much as he had. Finding all his life events and everything that happened to him that might have had impact on his work is quite a task for a historian. But in a true satisfying manner, what Herbert Simon would have loved to hear, I will go with whatever information I found about him in different fields. Probably one of the very first influences on his life was his family. His mom was an accomplished pianist and his dad was an engineer who became an independent patent attorney. If you ask me, that already is winning a lottery. Having parents who are from completely different backgrounds, one engineer and one artist, you have the chance to see how differently they approach life. His uncle also is mentioned as one of his earliest inspiration. He was an economist who studied economy in a school run by John R. Cummins. John R. Cummins was an institutional economist. He was best known for his work on analyzing collective action within state and other institutions. With Herbert Simon having access to his uncle's library and getting to know all these ideas about economy, psychology, and social science, it's no wonder that he was well equipped to discuss tax, poverty, and social rights in his debate team. It's also mentioned in some accounts of his life that being exposed to these literature through his uncle made him aware of the possibility of studying human behavior and human decision-making using scientific methods. The university he chose for his undergraduate studies and later for his PhD, University of Chicago, was a very unique one. In the early 20th century, cities were growing rapidly. Migration and industrialization were having huge impacts on cities and urban life. So the changing social fabric of the cities became a very interesting topic for a wide range of scholars. The University of Chicago was in the heart of one of the fastest growing cities in the US. So it became a focal point for this new field of study called urban sociology. Robert Park, who's often referred to as the father of urban sociology, was a key figure in University of Chicago. He considered city as a social laboratory where human behaviors and social structures could be observed and analyzed. This was such an attractive opportunity, not only for urban planners, designers, architects, and social scientists, but also for economists, political scientists, and those who were involved in studying collective behavior and decision-making. The School of Chicago not only managed to bring together scholars from a wide range of backgrounds, it also enabled them to connect their theories to what was happening on the ground in the cities. What connected all these fields together was the problem of how these collective structures of society can be understood and managed. And that's basically the core of what urban planning is about. I will talk about urban planning and whatever happened to it as a field in another episode. But before planning redefined itself as a political profession, it was all about decision-making and decision science. And it had very tight collaborations with so many other fields. When Simon joined University of Chicago in 1933 as a student, the works on urban sociology was already at its peak. You can imagine what a unique training he received in his undergraduate studies. He also worked with such a unique group of people during his PhD. Here's just a number of known figures he worked with during his time at University of Chicago. Henry Schultz, who was an economist and a statistician, and one of the founders of econometrics, which is the idea of using statistical methods to analyze economic data. Then we have Harold Laswell, who undoubtedly was one of the most interdisciplinary scholars in Chicago School. He was a political scientist and communication theorist. One of the interesting things that's written about him is that he was a one-man university whose competence in and contribution to anthropology, communications, economics, law, philosophy, psychology, psychiatry, and sociology are enough to make him a political scientist in the model of classical Greece. One of the unique contributions he had was his communication model and his method for content analysis. The other person working on similar topics in University of Chicago was Rudolf Carnap. He was a philosopher and a major member of the Vienna Circle. His work was mainly concerned with understanding the structure of languages rather than the meaning or the context. Semantics was what he was interested in. The other influential figure for Simon in University of Chicago was Nicholas Reshevsky. He was a physicist and one of the pioneers of mathematical biology. That might not sound exactly in line with what Simon was working on, but Reshevsky published a book in 1947 on mathematical theory of human relations. In the early 1930s, when Simon joined University of Chicago, Reshevsky had already developed one of the first models of neural networks. The last and arguably one of the most influential things that happened to Simon at University of Chicago was attending a course called Measuring Municipal Governments. The course was run by Clarence Ridley. 2 years before that, in 1934, Ridley had published a book called The City Manager Profession. As a planning student, I didn't know about this book until I read about Herbert Simon. I know this part is not very relevant to Herbert Simon's story, but I will add this just for the sake of planners because it's too interesting not to add this. Someone has written a review of his book, which goes like this. In 1927, Dr. Leonard D. White gave us The City Manager, a book which called attention to a new type of municipal official. Since that time, the term city manager has become much better known, and there have come to be many more city managers. Attempts have been made in much fugitive writing to bring this public functionary into some kind of focus and to get a picture of some accuracy. There still remains a widespread impression, however, that he is just a new name and perhaps little else. Fond of devices, Americans have turned to another. But municipal administration remains a kind of game nonetheless. Herbert Simon became so interested in these topics that he ended up becoming a research assistant to Clarence Ridley, and ultimately made him a name in the field of organizational decision-making. He later joined Rand Corporation, which is a whole other story on its own. Rand Corporation was such a unique institution that you can't really compare it to anything we have today, not even to the Rand Corporation itself today. I will talk about Rand Corporation very briefly in the next episode. But if you're interested in knowing more about the works that were happening in Rand Corporation then, there's this really nice book called Soldiers of Reason, written by Alex Abella, which goes through all the details of how it came about and who were the main figures working there and what was the whole goal of setting up Rand Corporation. If you take the approach that Alan Newell, Clive Shaw, and Herbert Simon himself took to creativity, all that Herbert Simon did could have been predicted by the institutions he worked in, by the trainings he had, and the people he worked with. It doesn't even stop there. Their approach promised that you can make as many Herbert Simon as you want. All you need is to identify what structures and information they need and to provide them with those. But who identifies the elements of this structure and how they're identified is a big question. Someone might look at Herbert Simon's history and say, well, it was the interdisciplinary nature of the courses he took that made him so successful. So let's just put more money in interdisciplinary studies in universities and make it easier for students to enroll in such courses. What I presented to you as life and works of Herbert Simon was in fact the result of applying such understanding of creativity to the works of Herbert Simon himself. Most of the information I found about Herbert Simon in computer science, in psychology, and in design were all about the works he did, the courses he took, the lectures he had. These are all fundamentally information about structures within which he was living and working, the repeatable and replicable elements of his story. You're kind of pushed to only think about structures and elements that are reproducible. You won't really talk about characters of these people that Simon worked with. You wouldn't even care about the non-replicable characteristics of Simon himself. What was he like? Was he a happy person? Was he optimistic? Was he sad? Was it an easy person to work with? Was him being nice a factor in making those connections and being successful in these many interdisciplinary works he did? There's a book written by Susan Rogers called This Is What It Sounds Like. There's a chapter where she talks about Stradivarius violins. They're known to be the best violins ever made. Because they're so famous, there's been so many studies on how they were made, what made them so special, and what is the key factor in the violin making such a unique sound. You might think that because they're so well studied and we know what made them so unique, that we can use the same recipe and create great violins again. But she says that that's pretty much impossible. It wasn't just the shape of the violin, the length of it, or the way it was made that made these violins so special. It was also the wood and varnish that was available to these violin makers in Renaissance Italy. We know which trees and which plants they used to create these violins, but even that information is not enough to replicate them. The biochemical compounds in the water, soil, and air today is very different than what it was in Renaissance Italy. When they made these violins, the varnish and the wood didn't have sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, heavy metals, plastics, and petroleum. So the idea of being able to replicate these violins with same quality is almost a fantasy. But then she asks if it even matters, if we can replicate them or not. She refers to a study done in 2012, where they gave 17 violinists a combination of old and new violins, including 2 Stradivarius ones. The violinists didn't know which violin they're playing, but they could play each violin as long as they wished to. At the end, the researchers asked them, which instrument did you like the best? Surprisingly, none of them chose Stradivarius ones. Well, although Stradivarius violins has such a big reputation, there are only 500 of them left in existence, and most of them have already been repaired or modified at some point. So even top-tier violinists have never, and probably would never, experience the original sound of a Stradivarius violin. So even if we manage to make the exact replica of those violins, the top-tier violinists might not choose them, not because they're not good enough, but because the sounds have changed, our taste has changed. What we're used to is not similar to what original Stradivarius sounded like. Some elements in the history of ideas are similar to the biochemical compounds of the air, water, and soil in the case of violins. You don't have them anymore. When Simon and others were doing the works they did, the boundaries of disciplines were not so well defined. Some of these disciplines weren't even there. The way those scholars look at the world without those frames of minds and well-defined boundaries is not something you can replicate today. We don't have them, we don't know how to experience it, and we don't even know how those scholars experienced that. It wasn't just the fact that different scholars from different backgrounds were working together, but it was also the case that the lack of well-defined boundaries for disciplines meant that these scholars had completely different attitude towards the phenomena they look at and the way they approach them. The advocates of creativity as something still a bit mysterious and magical would focus on a whole different side of Simon's story. They might talk about his childhood, his experiences, his friendships, the books he read, or the music he listened to. Some of this information hasn't even been documented. Probably because for fields like urban planning, design, and engineering, this information has never been interesting or relevant. Art and design exhibitions always start with a short biography of the curator or the artist behind the exhibition. Knowing the artist, their background, experiences they had, influences they had, is almost complementary to the artwork they produced. It's as if you need to know that background to really engage with the artwork itself. In social science, though, we're mostly interested in scholars' background, personality, characteristics, and experiences. when their life story complement or contradict the idea they've come up with. Otherwise, it's the idea itself that matters. What different disciplines highlight about Herbert Simon's work and life is a reflection of what they think was a contributing factor to his success. And this might sound extremely obvious, but we are so used to such reductive views of historical events and so obsessed with the idea of replicating successes of past that we often forget that there are so many other ways we can look at these historical events, and there's so many other conclusions we can arrive at if we choose a different way of looking at the past. But what most scholars would agree on is that it makes sense why so many people were against absolute originality as a criteria for creativity in science. See, none of Herbert Simon's ideas were absolutely new or original. Simon, like many other scientists, was standing on the shoulders of the giants. And the minds of the giants of his time was occupied with collective action, collective decision-making, and future thinking. But why decision-making became such an important topic for all these scholars? That's the question that we'll get into in the next episode.